Well, it's time, isn't it? The GBNews Tavern is open. Sadly, I'm still in Barcelona, but I will be back in that studio tomorrow. So it's a long-distance Talking Pints with Baroness Helena Morrissey. Helena, welcome to the programme. I'm sorry that it's remote. Tell me something.
Hello.
As a campaigner, how do you respond to that comment of the Taliban's about International Women's Day?
Well, as the suffragette said, it's deeds, not words. And unfortunately as well, of course, the Taliban seems to make up its own interpretation of Islamic law. So ever since they've come back into power, I'm afraid all the news has been pretty dire for women. We hear stories of girls not being able to go to school and finish their education, terrible treatment of women. So I'm afraid it doesn't really cut much ice with me, Nigel.
No, I didn't think it would. And before we talk about your business career and your various campaigns that are very much ongoing and campaigns that you believe in passionately, the single most important thing about you, of course, is that you have 9 children. And I'm just wondering, because, you know, I'm here in Spain for a few days because of a child issue. And the more children you have, the more issues there are, little problems, difficulties, successes. How on earth do you manage, with 9 children, a busy business life with AJ Bell now, various charities, other commitments? How on earth do you manage it all?
Well, some days not terribly well, Nigel. I mean, you're right. The more children you have, the more issues there are. My husband is brilliant. He's always been a huge supporter. He's the reason I've been able to have the career, really, because he's been a stay-at-home dad since we had our 4th child. But yeah, you're right. Some days there just aren't enough parents to go around, I'm afraid.
No, well, I mean, I have to say it's a very, very impressive juggling act, and you clearly do it very, very well. I'm guessing that the only way you can do all of these things is perhaps just not to sleep very much.
Or else not be too worried about being imperfect and not quite get everything right all the time, Nigel. I've learned to let go. Sometimes if something is not quite right, just, you know, it's good enough. So yeah, not much sleep and not being a perfectionist. Those are the 2 real secrets, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, you manage it somehow. Now, I went into the London Metal Exchange in 1982 and spent 20 years there before politics kind of took over. It wasn't really planned, but politics kind of took over my life. And I remember the city of the 80s and into the 1990s. And partly it was because an open outcry exchange was naturally, you know, a fairly aggressive kind of place. But let's face it, whether we looked at, in those days, whether we looked at the Stock Exchange, Lloyd's of London, pension fund management, any of those industries, I mean, women were pretty few and far between. And I think a lot of women that did work in those in those businesses, you know, tried it for a couple of years, didn't like it, got out, decided it wasn't for them. How did you manage when you first started out in that city of London?
Well, you're right, Nigel. I mean, it was blokey. I was the only woman in a team of 16. I was a bond fund manager. I remember visiting the London Metal Exchange, actually, and watching the open outcry. That was probably more macho than my day-to-day existence. But, you know, people thought nothing of taking clients to lap dancing clubs and that sort of thing. So it was a kind of weird environment. I'm not a quitter. I am a bit sort of, you know, belligerent about persevering with things. And when I was passed over for promotion after having my first child, and I hadn't changed my working habits, you know, I was still working hard, and I was told it wasn't to do with my performance, but some doubt over my commitment with the baby. I'm afraid that sort of unleashed a determination in me to both forge my career in the city, but also to actually try to eventually, when I had a bit more power, do something for other women.
Yeah, I mean, so having children, you know, I mean, obviously maternity leave, and it depends how much time you take off. But I mean, I am presuming that if you take lots of time off because you've had children, that makes it much harder, presumably, when you come back.
It does. I mean, I didn't ever, and I'm not proud of this, I didn't take that much time off. I mean, with my last child, because then I was the CEO of an investment company, and you could only take less than 12 weeks. Otherwise, you had to sort of give your job to somebody else. So I took 11 weeks. So that's not a long time in the scheme of a big career or a long career. So I think, obviously, if you take a year off each child, I mean, if I had 9 years off with 9 children, that would have been somewhat detrimental to my career. But we're talking about relatively short times. And, of course, nowadays, you can still stay in touch. And, obviously, a lot of people are working in a hybrid way and perhaps come back and forward. We can debate merits of that. But, you know, things have changed quite a bit about working habits.
Yeah. Yeah, I think actually it's probably easier now, isn't it? You know, the idea of working from home and, you know, Zoom calls and connectivity and all the rest of it. I can see now, actually, it must be easier than it used to be when you had to be, you know, at your desk for 8 o'clock or whatever it was. How do you assess, Helena? Because financial services, it doesn't get, you know, frankly, much of a good reputation. People sort of think evil bankers and all the rest of it. And yet, you know, you and I both know it's Britain's biggest industry. It's something we're really good at. How is it dealing with Brexit?
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously, the whole image of the city is more than just how we're dealing with Brexit. But I think we've been slow as a city. And, you know, I was on the side of Brexit. I was a rather lone voice out publicly in support of Brexit prior to the referendum. And I think for the first few years after the vote in 2016, the city behaved as if it was on a sort of damage limitation exercise. You know, that we were losing some access to EU clients, that we would tread very carefully so we didn't lose much of the existing business. And I think as time's gone on, as the reality has emerged, that there actually are opportunities to seize. And now we're seeing more bold lobbying going on. I mean, just now it's a subject your listeners or watchers, viewers might not want me to get into in too much detail, but, you know, the idea about reforming Solvency II, which is basically the regulatory framework for insurance companies, this is a big deal. I mean, this is something which will mean that instead of money, capital sitting idly on insurance balance sheets, it can be put to productive use. And finally, the city, I think, is waking up. This is, you know, it's a terrible environment we're in lots of ways. We obviously know we've got terrible oil and other energy price increases that are going to be very detrimental to the economy, inflation at 30-year high, etc. Lots of difficulties. But we need to seize this moment. The regulations, the legal framework needs to be right for the UK, not now having to be right for 27 or 28 countries.
No, well, I have to say I felt that passionately for years and years and years. And indeed, actually, it was my time working on the metal exchange that really made me a Brexiteer, because I could see the global dimension of what London was doing, and I felt doing it quite well. But tell me something, honestly. You know, John Glenn is the city minister. He's the guy talking about these regulatory reforms, and I welcome all of that. But honestly, do number 10 Downing Street, do Whitehall, do they actually understand money and financial markets?
Oh, that's going to lead me to a very harsh answer, isn't it? Because I'm afraid the closer I get to that, and now I'm in the House of Lords, the less convinced I am that they do. But I do think they know sometimes who to ask, and I think they're getting more realistic, perhaps because it's a needs must. You know, they don't have all the answers. You know, a lot of my campaigning around having more women in the city is partly because we want diversity of thought, we want new opinions, different perspectives. And I think they're realising, actually, you know, we absolutely have to have the expertise from the city. So I think they're not trying to go it alone so much. That I welcome.
Well, I have to say that was a very diplomatic and very polite answer. I've got to tell you, having spent 20 years in the European Parliament, I don't think most people in politics have got a clue about money or financial markets or any of those things. And you mentioned a moment ago, you mentioned the House of Lords. I mean, obviously, I'm imagining you're not spending a huge amount of time there. But I mean, can there be a more disconnected group of people anywhere in this country, disconnected from the real world, disconnected from reality, than the House of Lords?
I've only got a few friends there. I don't want to make all enemies, but I do feel it's a bit out of touch. I'm being, you know, I was diplomatic before, but now I go in and, you know, I'm afraid I haven't really found my métier there. And sometimes one sits through things that, you know, once we had a discussion on another of your favourite topics, on green energy, and there was a long debate about lead shot in pigeons, which, you know, really, I thought anyone tuning in is going to think we've completely lost the plot. So I'm afraid I have to agree with you. I do feel there must be a better way to get, you know, a review. I think the thing it does well is, it is trying to review government legislation that might be done in a real hurry, might be curtailing our freedoms sort of on the sly. That's a really important thing to do, but there has to be a better way of doing it than sort of having this rather archaic, I'm just not the kind of person that likes to jump up and shout, my lords, and have everybody sort of, wait on what I'm saying. So, it's a bit of a challenge for me to find a way in. I'll keep persevering. As I said, I'm not a quitter, Nigel.
No, I'm sure you will. I've absolutely no doubt about that. Now, in the wake of the horrible events, terrible events that are going on in Ukraine, energy is becoming, one of the most debated topics in the world. And as you will know, I'm doing my best to try and have a debate about this. I'm calling for a referendum on net zero because I want these things to be discussed. I just want to ask you, can we afford the government's current net zero plans?
So the big problem, of course, is it's not being properly costed. And so often, and this probably goes back to this idea that you floated earlier, that the government might not really understand how the economy works. You cannot really announce, or you shouldn't really announce, these big schemes without having a clue about how much they'll cost. I watched your interview yesterday with Dale Vince of Ecotricity, and I know you mentioned that the previous Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has estimated it's going to be £1 trillion. Obviously, other analyses that are done in the private sector suggest there'll be some offsetting benefits. We have to do the cost-benefit analysis. But all those costs, or most of them, would be upfront. And of course, we can't afford that at the moment. We however much people want to have and aspire to a lower carbon world and net zero, perhaps, we just can't afford it when we're basically on the verge of stagflation, I'm afraid.
No, I'm afraid I think that's absolutely right. And I suspect that is going to be something that really starts to happen, a big change. I noticed today that the tradable price of carbon has fallen very, very sharply within the European market. And that's a reflection that Italy, Germany, countries that have made themselves so dependent on Russia, are going to have to start digging coal or doing whatever they are going to have to do in the very, very short term. Now, nearly everybody has money going into pensions, whether it's through a workplace scheme or whether it's through their own private provision. And generally, we give this money to the industry to look after us. There are a few people who now are seeking financial independence. Somebody watching this programme who's 35, self-employed, wants to put some money aside. What, in your view, should they do? How much control should they have over their own money?
Well, having control over your money is tantamount to having more control over your destiny. So you need to do something. A lot of people, I think, are afraid because they don't understand the jargon that our industry uses too much of. They just don't know where to get started. I've signed up, Nigel, to your Fortune and Freedom emails, and I'm watching your videos and so forth. So I know what you're trying to achieve here, and I think it's a good aim. AJ Bell, which is trying to, its motto, its mission is to help more people invest. It's very simple to understand. It's low cost. It's really trying to give people the very basic understanding to make those decisions that will, the things you decide now will obviously affect your financial future in a big way. And I'm afraid too many people head in the sand. Good news about auto-enrollment, having company pensions that you don't even sort of pay into, but the company does it for you, and perhaps you match it, is that more people have, perhaps not to their knowledge particularly, but they've got a pension going on in the background. But yeah, take control of your financial destiny and it'll help you lead a better life.
On that very positive note, on International Women's Day, I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in, doing Talking Pints. I apologise that for family reasons it's remote, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for having me on.
Baroness Morrissey, for being our guest today.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.